I'm recording a tiny bonus video right now to talk about what a retain statement is. I was asked if this is different than a keep statement, and the answer is yes. So a keep statement, you may or may not have watched the lesson yet, but that has to do with selecting variables that we want to keep in a data set. So let's say that I had in this data set I'm creating here, ID, visit, and ICD, and I only want to keep ID in a new data set. I could say data ICD IDs, set ICD, and then keep ID, and then run that, and then I would lose all of the information for visit and ICD and be left only with that one variable that I kept. So instead, let's talk about a retain statement. I'm creating a data set here called ICD with 3 variables, a little bit redundant: ID, visit, and ICD code. And I have different IDs. People can have multiple visits. So what you see here, for example, is ID number 1 has 6 visits. There's a different ICD code associated with each visit. I just made these up, so do not call me out if they make no sense. We have an ID number 2. They have 5 visits and 5 different ICD codes, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and submit that statement. And then let's just quickly look at the data. So proc print data equals ICD, and let's just run that so we can look at what we have. All right, so you see we have our different IDs, multiple visits within IDs. Some people only have 1 visit. For example, 7 and 8, they only have 1 visit. And then we have ICD codes. I want to know whether these patients in my data set have an ICD code that is either equal to I-21, I-22, I-23, I-24, or I-25 across any of their visits. So essentially what I'm looking for is a data set with 1 row for each person showing me if they have any of those diagnoses across their multiple observations. So to do that, I'm creating a data set called ICD new. I'm setting ICD, and I'm doing this by ID because I want this information, the presence or absence of these 5 different ICD codes, specific within each ID. And the first thing I have here is a retain statement. And these are for variables, new variables that I'm creating called I-21 up through I-25. So that will be I-21, I-22, I-23, I-24, and I-25. And this retain statement by ID will basically say to retain the value for each ID and carry it throughout. And this will make more sense in just one moment. I'm starting with an array. Again, if you have not already watched that lesson, this will make more sense later. But basically what I want to do is iterate through these 5 variables, I-21 through I-25, and fill in these 0s and 1s across multiple records. So I have a first ID, so the first observation for an ID in the data set, I'm setting all of those variables equal to 0, because so far I haven't looked to see whether the ICD code is in fact the ICD code I am looking for. I then end that statement. Then I go through each row and I say, if the ICD code is equal to I-21, then I-21, this new variable, becomes 1. Similarly, if the ICD code variable is equal to I-22, then I-22, that variable becomes equal to 1, so on and so forth up through I-25. And then I'm outputting only the last record. So I start here for person 1, right, at their first observation, and I'm outputting by the time I hit their last observation. And the issue here is that if I hit I-21 earlier on in the data set, I need that value to be retained. I need it to carry through all the way to that last record rather than getting reset to 0, rather than setting to missing, rather than anything else. Anytime a 1 occurs, anytime something gets flagged as a 1, I need it to carry through and be retained for that ID before I start over. So I'm going to run this, and let's do another proc print and take a look. Proc print data equals ICD new, run. All right, so what do we see now? We see an ID 1, and we have appropriately 0s all the way up through, we have a 1 for I-25. It looks like ID number 2 they had ICD code 21 somewhere. It was retained all the way through, then the 0 for everything else. Some people had no ICD code that I was looking for. So person 8, for example, doesn't have that. Person 6 does not have that. And I'm just going to scroll up to our previous print so you can see, for example, that ID 2 has an ICD code of I-21 and ID 1 has an ICD code of I-25. So here we go, ID 1, there we go, I-25. Here we have ID 2, and on their second visit, they do indeed have an I-21. Let's show now how this can go wrong. If I get rid of that retain statement, then I stop carrying the values through, right? So once I start at the first ID with that first row, if I've created a 0 or a 1, I want that to carry forward all the way through until I hit the last record and output the data set. Without the retain statement, that will not happen. So I'm going to set up this proc print, data equals ICD, wrong, run. All right. So let's go ahead and run this and print out the data. This looks quite different. And what are we noticing? So all of the zeros are gone. All of the ones for many of the things are gone. And the only things that are retained are when it was both the first, the last record and the first record. So 7 and 8, they each only had one record. So the first one is the same as the last one. So whatever I'm doing at that first ID, it's going to happen at the last ID as well, right? So scroll up again to the data. Person number 8, they had only a single visit. They had R04, so everything should be a 0, and I output it at that first/last record, and it looks correct. ID 7, they had only one visit. They had an I-24, and because that is their first and their last record, they appropriately have zeros for everything else and a 1 for I-24. The reason that ID 1 has a 1 appropriately for I-25 is because I-25 was the code on their last record. That was their last visit. However, I've lost all of the zeros. Those were not retained. They were not carried forward through my data set. This is another way that we can do things wrong, and perhaps slightly more common. And this here, I'm now missing. I put the retain statement back in, so great. However, I've forgotten to put if first.id, then set all my variables back to 0. And what you might be guessing and what you would be correct about is that now, anytime I hit that 1, it's going to carry all the way through. So it won't be within ID. I'm not going to be resetting or restarting anything. It's retaining things for too long. So let's set up the proc print. ICD wrong 2. Run. All right, so let's go ahead and run this and print. And indeed, we have failed to set anything to 0. That was something that I just no longer had in the code. You'll see I have nothing here that sets the value to 0. But if I go to my output, you notice that the first time a 1 occurs, it's getting retained all the way through. So person 1 had an ICD code of I-25 at one of their visits, and now everybody has apparently an ICD code of I-25, which is incorrect. The second that we hit an ICD code of I-21, that value is being retained for every single observation after that. Same thing for I-22, I-23, and I-24. So I'm not resetting my value with each new ID, and instead I've managed to retain the value throughout all ensuing observations. The last thing I want to do is just show you an alternative way that you might be able to accomplish this. I'm going to give you another proc print at the bottom. Data equals ICD alt 2. Let's actually take a look at ICD alt as well. Proc print data equals ICD alt. So the first thing that I'm doing here is with some simple if-else statements, I'm just creating some codes where I have new columns where there are 1s or 0s, but I'm not aggregating, right? So if someone had 6 visits, they're still going to have 6 rows. Let's look at that output. Oops, I got to print that. So if I go to my Oh, I forgot to put a run statement. Good job. That's what I get for doing this real time. Okay, so you can see, for example, that ID1, they still have all 6 of their visits. And they have zeros for I-21 at every visit, I-22 at every visit, I-23 at every visit, I-24 at every visit. But at I-25, they have a 1 for their last visit. So I've created dummy codes, these 0 or 1, yes or no, present or absent variables, but it's not really what I want yet because I have too many rows. I want 1 observation per person. Then what I can do is take a proc means. This is again a little bit advanced. This is a bonus lesson. And I'm asking my means to be output to a new data set. And I'm asking for the max within each ID of each of these variables. So let's look back at that output. What is the maximum value of I-21 for ID number 1? It's 0. Same for I-22, I-23, I-24, but the maximum value for I-25 is 1. So essentially what I'm going to be doing here is getting a summary that says, what is the maximum for each of these 5 variables by ID, which will give me, as you may have guessed, 1 row per individual. So if I run that and I print those data out, you now get something that looks very similar to that first, well, identical to that very first data set, this one ICD new, where we did this in a much more compact way using a retain statement.